So I'm Liz from the Bozeman Public Library. This is our first in a series of speaker talks dealing with financial literacy, financial issues. In March, we have Dr. Marcia Getting, who's going to be coming out and talking about estate planning for a three-part program, the last 3 Thursdays of March. Other than that, this is being recorded. We will post the video up on our YouTube page. And hopefully we're all staying a little bit warm. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joel.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and get set up to share here. First of all, just a little background. I'm an economist at Montana State University. So I enjoy the opportunity sometimes to get to share a little bit about what we do here and some of the things about everyday issues that a lot of you probably deal with that have an economics angle. Please feel free to drop questions in the question and answer pod. I will keep that open and keep an eye on it. So happy to take questions, just like as if we were in an in-person session. It's always a little more interactive if we get some questions. So with that, let's talk a little bit about inflation. How did we get here, and when is this higher inflation going to end? So that's kind of going to be the theme here today, and we'll talk about it in a couple different kind of ways. First of all, I want to make sure we all kind of understand what inflation is, or at least what the number is that you hear about in the news. I mean, we all see things when we go to the grocery store about it. And generally it's, the dollars you have just don't purchase as many goods or services is kind of the broad definition. So you go in with your $20 bill and it, just doesn't go as far as it did previously. That's the general idea of inflation. However, the number you hear on the news has to be sort of a formula and standard and something they can track over time. So they have indexes that are created by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is part of the US government. And there's a whole variety of them, but the most common one is called the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. And what they do is they've went out and they've looked at how consumers across the US spend their money collectively as a group. And they're saying here that 42% of people's budgets go towards housing. 2.5% goes towards apparel. Transportation is 18%. Medical care is 8.5%. You can see all these categories there. But I can tell you right now that even if I looked at my budget and you looked at your budget, I'm not going to look exactly like this pie chart, and you're not either. So it's an average. Parts of the country may have different amounts. Some people may choose to live in a larger house or have more kids or drive further to work, so their transportation costs might be higher or lower than the next person. But we're going to talk about this sort of theoretical index that accounts for everybody. But just recognize that, you might say, well, I don't think inflation's as high as what they're saying. It isn't for me. That could certainly be true. And it could be that your next door neighbor is experiencing inflation that's higher than the national average, just because of sort of their life situation, their lifestyles, the things they choose to do. But that's what inflation is that you're hearing about on the news, is typically this consumer price index. Now, there are also other indexes like the producer price index. There's regional ones, there's state by state ones. So sometimes the number you hear, or even if you see two numbers the same day from different news organizations or something, it could be they're just citing different indexes that are out there. But the consumer price index is certainly the most common. And we'll generally talk about that tonight, but it doesn't particularly matter which one we talk about. They all work somewhat similarly. So next, this is what inflation has looked like on an annual basis since 1970. And what you can see is in the late 70s, inflation was running well over 6% pretty much every year for almost a decade. And we had years, there were 3 years where it was over 12%. So nearly double what we experienced last year, where we were just over 6%. And 2022 was actually a little bit lower than 2021. But we had all really come to get used to, if you look here from about the early 90s until about 2020, we rarely saw inflation over 4%. And we'll talk in a minute, but oftentimes 2% is kind of the target rate that the Federal Reserve Bank is hoping the economy hits for inflation. And you see a number of years in here that were well below the 2% rate. So in some of these years, the problem wasn't high inflation, but it was not enough inflation. So how did we get from that situation to this? And that's what we'll kind of focus on here tonight. And again, just kind of to highlight this, a 2017 headline, what's killing inflation? The only problem is the Fed is on pace to miss their inflation target on the low side for the 6th straight year. Right. So that was an inflation just 6 short years ago. We were worried about essentially, why isn't there enough inflation in the economy? So now we've went from that environment to this environment where we've seen the highest inflation we've had in about 20 years in the last 2 years. So there's 2 general categories of things that influence inflation. And I want to talk about them in these 2 sort of big buckets that we're going to talk about. There's some other things, and there's some things that may cross over between the 2. But the first is what economists like to call supply side issues. So these are factors that affect the supply of goods. So that could be a drought impacting how much wheat is grown, or corn, or your favorite oranges or apples or something like that. It could also be some type of workforce disruption. So a factory or a flour mill can't produce as much stuff because they don't have workers because of maybe the coronavirus. Maybe even like a strike or something, or anything that could prevent workers from sort of being available would affect then how much product that particular company could produce. So that can affect the supply of goods. And on a smaller scale, you might see things like a fire, could stop the production of a particular item for a while. And then, animal disease could certainly come in, and we'll talk a little bit about, if you may remember, what they called mad cow disease from 15 or 20 years ago, and what that did to the beef industry. And then bird flu with its impact on egg prices, and we'll talk some more about that. But those are all issues that are affecting how many goods are produced in the economy. The other types of influences are what we call demand side. So these are things that affect how much people want of a particular product or good that's out there. So, a new iPhone or something comes out, and also there's a demand for this product. So more people are buying cell phones than there were a year ago because this new fancy product became available that everybody wants. That could be one example. Another could be a change in consumer choices. During the pandemic, we saw people shift from services to more goods, which just collectively meant people were buying a lot more things and less services than they used to. So that meant we kind of needed more things in the economy to be bought. And then you may see kind of broader things too. If consumers across the board have more income, they're going to tend to buy more things across the economy. So they're going to demand more goods out there. So those are kind of the 2 buckets that I want to talk about. So we'll start with supply side issues, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about some of these demand factors that are in play as well. All right, so first let's talk about some challenges with the US workforce that we saw. So first of all, for those of you that remember the pandemic from, I guess we're getting on almost 3 years ago, is kind of when the shutdowns started for the coronavirus. So some workers lost their job that spring or early summer, and sometimes that was temporary. There were big issues with the larger meat processing plants in the Midwest about keeping their workers healthy. They were kind of in a shoulder-to-shoulder environment in terms of how they worked. Very difficult to stop the spread of coronavirus, so they temporarily had to close some of those plants, and some workers lost their jobs. No one really went anywhere, so that meant airline workers lost their job, at least temporarily for some industries. Also during this time period, we had some folks that lost their jobs more permanently. So, there were a couple restaurants like here in Bozeman that when this shutdown happened, they just simply closed their doors, and those folks lost their job, essentially permanently, and had to look for work elsewhere. We've seen a lot of skilled nursing home facilities close in the last couple of years. So some workers lost their jobs. And then some workers simply chose to leave the workplace as well. So in Montana in 2011, we had a total of about 150,000 retirees in the state. Now we've got about 190,000. And part of that is, people obviously choose. There's not a mandatory retirement age per se, but some of this is our baby boomers just demographically moving into retirement years. But it could also be that somebody decided to retire, maybe they decided the coronavirus was a health risk and I'm just going to retire a year or 2 earlier than I had originally planned to. So that would fit with that story as well. We also see a lot more caregivers right now in the economy. So workers who could be out in the workplace, but instead they've made the choice to not have a 4-pay job and are providing care for either a child or maybe an elderly relative or spouse as well. So I want to show some pictures here because hopefully that's better than words. What we're looking at here is the labor supply in the US. And by labor supply, this is the percent change in the number of people that got a W-2 in a particular month. So this is from just before the pandemic, February of 2020, until December of 2022. And what you'll see is all the blue states are states that have more people working than they did prior to the pandemic. So Montana's a blue state. So we've increased almost 4% of our workforce, which is about 26,000 workers more working in Montana now than we had in February of 2020. So when you drive around town and you notice all these help wanted signs, it's not because people aren't working. There are more workers in Montana than there were before, but the economy has grown. And obviously workers would still continue to hire if there were some additional workers available. But it's not been evenly spread across the country. I mean, we see Idaho and Utah had stronger employment growth than Montana did. But then other neighbors to us like North Dakota and Wyoming have considerably less smaller workforce than they did prior to the pandemic. So the upper Midwest, the Northeast, Nevada, California have all lost workers, and then kind of the Northwest region, Rocky Mountain states, and the Southeast have gained workers over that. And the US, as far as the country at whole, we just got positive numbers of workforce in December. I had done a similar talk to this, and I had numbers through November of 2020, and they were still at a negative relative to that. So the workforce has been tight collectively here for a couple of years, and it does vary depending on where you're at. Now, even within Montana, I showed that nice picture that said kind of Montana's one state, but there's a lot of regional differences within Montana. So on the left here, you can see that Montana has gained about 5% of our workforce. This is starting with 100% in 2020. We lost about 10% of our workforce, in just a month or two, regained it basically by the end of the year. And then we've added about 5% more workers collectively in the state since February of 2020. Now here in Gallatin County, we had the same dip. We lost about 10%. We gained back at about the same time as the state did. But then since that time, we've gained about 12% of our workforce compared to 5% for the state. So the kind of some of the trends we've had in Gallatin County for a number of years that we're kind of outperforming the economy, people are moving here, we're attracting workers, is still carried true throughout the pandemic. Now, this is a little bit different number I want to show you. This is called the labor force participation rate. Labor force participation rate is basically the number of people who are working is kind of the top of the fraction. The bottom of the fraction is everybody that's basically over age 16 in the US. So there's a lot of folks that are over 16 that aren't working, and that could be a high school student, could be a college student, it could be a parent staying at home to be a caregiver, it could be someone who's retired. So this number is never going to be 100, but this is a much broader look than what we had in that previous graph there. But what you can see is that in 2003, we had about 66.5% of Americans over age 16 were employed. And that was staying kind of steady until about 2008, 2009, when the recession hit, and that's the gray bar here. And then since then, we've been on this kind of steady decline. It kind of leveled out a little bit, and then we had a big drop during the pandemic. And since then, it came back a little, but it's still at a level that's quite a bit lower than prior to the pandemic, and a lot lower than it was in 2008. So part of this dip is just a long-term trend of baby boomers hitting retirement age. But then there has been some decline just since the pandemic as well. So the point I wanted to make with this is we aren't necessarily gaining workers by the number of people we have here. The main way that states have gained workers is by getting in migration from somewhere else in the country or in the world. So Montana has more workers now than we did in 2020, not because more people are choosing to work of those that were here, but because people have relocated to here and are working. So a little bit different nuance there on that story. So some of the states that have lost workers isn't necessarily because people are choosing to work less necessarily. out migration to other states is also a part of what's happening in the labor force. Montana here, we've lost about a little less than 1.5% in terms of labor force participation from January 2020 to December of 2022. To give you an idea, if we were still at 63.7% today, we'd have about 12,500 more workers available in the Montana economy if that number had just stayed constant or had returned back to the level it was just prior to the pandemic. All right, so what does all of that mean? Well, if labor becomes scarce, so there's less workers out there, businesses have to respond to this. They have raised pay rates, and if you've been around Bozeman, you've probably seen signs that are a lot higher on "come work for us for this rate," and it's more than it was. They've also offered more benefits to workers, and that could be anything from health insurance to dental benefits to scholarship to tuition reimbursement, things like that. It could also be as simple as flexible scheduling. You know, maybe in the past they said you had to work from 8 to 5. Maybe now they're willing to let someone work from 9 to 3 so they can pick up and drop off kids at school in a way that they wouldn't have done, you know, prior to this. They might offer limited hours of service. Many of you, probably your favorite businesses around, may not be open as long as they once were. Or they might offer less services. The auto repair shop that I've used for many years here used to be I could take my car down, drop it off, and then they would give me a ride back to work. They'll pick me up when it's done. They don't do the ride, drop off, and pick up anymore because they're just a little bit understaffed. So I have to coordinate that myself with going to it. So they're offering one less service to customers. And then on a longer term, as businesses, you might see start investing in automation. So if they can buy tools to make things more efficient, have a little bit less labor involved, and that's going to vary by industry, how well they can do that as well. But kind of the last step for a lot of these is all of these things are likely expensive to some extent, which means they're going to raise the price of the goods and services that they provide. And so this is where we're kind of adding upward pressure to inflation. So all that labor force shortage thing leads to this bottom line of, you know, increased prices. Now, consumers also respond, you know, as labor becomes more scarce, and this is just not on you providing labor to the market, but on you being a customer of businesses. Some goods that are more labor intensive than others may become more expensive quicker than others or at a faster rate. So you might shift away from a particular product. So maybe you used to like, I don't know, hand-picked apples, and now you're going to switch, you know, to strawberries that can be machine picked or something like that. So there can be some product shifting because inflation is going to hit different products a little bit differently. Maybe you're going to do something like takeout and then do less dining in a restaurant, you know, because either the restaurant isn't available or it's more expensive to do that, or the service isn't good, or you have to wait longer. I know I was at a restaurant here about a month ago in town, and they only had one portion of the seating open because they only had enough wait staff to handle a small group. So here we were standing at the door, you know, with our name on a list, looking at empty tables in half the restaurant. So consumers may make choices to do takeout if that's the dine-in experience. A couple just kind of personal examples. I had, you know, I've always went in and had winter tires put on each fall. And, you know, they go in the morning. Typically, they're like, oh, yeah, we get them in. We'll get your car back to you at noon. And, you know, I went in and they said, well, we're taking appointments for 3 weeks from now. Well, that's not how it used to be. Right. So I ordered a second set of rims so that I can switch those myself without having to go to the tire shop in the future. So making a substitution there because the business is short of labor, I respond by doing some things to reduce my use of that labor in the long run. So same with sprinkler blowouts in the fall. The company that had done mine, understaffed, said they weren't going to do the route that I was on. So I got the tools to be able to do it myself. Again, just labor trade-offs that consumers make to adjust to these things. If you want, feel free to share an example. Maybe you've got something in the question and answer pod. Please feel free to type that in and we'll see. Maybe you've got some examples that I didn't mention or another thing you'd like to share. So I'll pause here for just a minute. All right, we'll go ahead and continue on here. The next piece I want to talk about is the stimulus programs. There were a lot of stimulus programs that came in several different packages, some major, some minor. There were also some small administrative rules, and there were some direct checks to people. There was the Paycheck Protection Program, student loan payments paused. There were grants directly to businesses, expanded unemployment benefits, rental assistance, and also a lot of funds that flowed to local governments in one way or another, both to state governments, county, city, municipalities, even some schools, and then a whole lot of really minor, products as well that were out there. So lots of different stimulus programs, and I don't want to go over those one by one, but I collectively want to say all of these things in general provided additional funds to consumers collectively or to businesses. So they had more ability to give them more money to be able to spend on other things. And that was the intent of these programs, was to make sure that people could keep spending and keep the economy kind of moving in a direct way. Now, some of these funds hit consumers immediately. So that check came to you the next day. If you wanted to go out and spend it all, you could. Others came sort of in waves. So if your student loan payments were paused, that was a little bit of money each month that you didn't have to send out the door, and it was stretched out over a longer period of time. And all of these programs kind of had different timeframes. And a lot of the local government support is still trickling down. So there's a big surplus in Helena right now that the state legislature is deciding what to do with. And some of that certainly came from these various stimulus programs, and they haven't even decided yet how it will be spent. And if they're going to, let's say, fix a road or a bridge or something, they'll have to allocate it. They won't pass that budget for a few months. July 1, it'll show up in maybe the Department of Transportation budgets. They'll put it out for bids. So these additional dollars are going to be flowing out the door for a number of months and even years based on stimulus packages that have already been passed in the past. So what I want to kind of collectively say about this is what we've got here is what's called the money supply. And I don't want you to get caught up in the details, but what I want to say, this is the percent increase in the money supply every month going back to 2005. And what you can see is most months, and it varies a lot, but between 0.5% and 1% is pretty typical of the money supply expanding. So there's a little bit more money out there. And you can see the recession of 2008. You saw here that it went up by about 3%. For a couple months, it was higher than this kind of less than 1% range that we had been seeing. So that was the stimulus following the 2008 housing related recession. And then you see it just sort of, continues along here at typically less than 1%. It got quite a lot lower in 2017 and 18 as the economy continued to grow. They tightened the money supply just a little bit. But then what you see in 2020 when the coronavirus recession hit, all of a sudden it jumps up by 7% right away, and then continues to expand for a number of months. And it isn't until kind of 2020 that we start to see it start to contract a little bit. So what this means is the response on the money supply side was way larger to the coronavirus pandemic than there was to the recession in 2008. And one of the critiques of the 2008 response was that the money that came out had too many rules, too many strings, and didn't get out there fast enough, and maybe there wasn't enough, and it made the recession much longer. Here's the pendulum has swung, and they put out a lot more money with a lot less strings this time to try to make the recession shorter. Now, the underlying causes of the recession are quite different, so I can't tell you if that worked or not, but it certainly lets you know a little bit about how big the fiscal response was to this recession. Now, just a world map here. We're not the only country that did this. All the countries with the dark green, they gave kind of similar percentages of their economic output as stimulus packages in some form. The lighter green is still stimulus, but a little bit less. And even the orange and red are also still positive stimulus packages. So really, especially the developed world gave much larger amounts, but everywhere across the world, governments did stimulus packages to try to keep the economy moving through the coronavirus pandemic. So all of that collectively means there's more money out there to go buy goods and services, right? So that's going to provide upward pressure on prices. There's more dollars trying to buy those same goods that are out there. So that's increasing the demand for those goods. And that's not just a US story, but it's a Canadian story, it's a European story. And a lot of the markets we compete in are world markets. So the fact that, you want a new iPhone, so does someone in Europe. So now collectively, we've all got more money to go after and try to buy that, right? So that's going to cause upward pressure on prices. Now, so first we kind of talked about some labor supply issues, and then we talked about some government responses, but then we also had geopolitical issues that happen, regularly across the world, and they're always unpredictable. And this time, a year ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, right? That's limited the production of some of the products and the exports from both Russia, Ukraine, probably Belarus, a couple other kind of nearby countries. And a lot of the products they made were energy and ag, which are some of the same products that Montana produces. So not only on the supply side and the demand side, we're both kind of directly affected. And it's very hard to predict these things. But this combined with other events can amplify the effects of some of the things that are going on. So, and there could be some other geopolitical issue in 2023 that we don't even know about yet, nor do I know how this particular conflict is going to end or when it's going to end either. So, but again, if you have, let's say, a wheat producing region like Ukraine is, and actually so is Russia, if you're going to war, maybe you're not quite as diligent about making sure you plant and harvest all of your wheat. So that's supply that isn't on the market. And again, less supply could mean higher prices collectively. Other supply side issues that just regularly happen, it could be a flood that could limit, say barge traffic up and down the Missouri River, or it could be a drought doing the same thing. Could impact, particular crops, how much production happens. And we always have things like hurricanes that might shut down a particular region of the US, maybe for a day or two, or maybe for an extended period if infrastructure is damaged, that again can limit the supply of particular products. And then I say cold or warm weather, and this certainly could be influence things like how much natural gas you use to heat your house. A cold snap could also damage orange trees in the citrus growing region. And then the number of oranges produced in that year is way less. So those kind of things can affect supply side issues as well. And I mentioned before we started here, talking a little bit about bird flu and egg prices. So eggs were similarly impacted to a lot of other goods where we saw, feed prices were going up, labor supply issues, so we saw egg prices rise. But then on top of that, here, about a month ago, a Wall Street Journal headline said egg prices surged to records as the bird flu hits the poultry flock. So we had this disease, avian influenza. They got into some of the egg laying facilities, which meant one, it made a lot of birds sick and it caused a lot of mortality. But the way to typically manage the spread of that is to destroy the flock. So you destroy the flock, you can't get a new flock the next day. You have to raise them from chicks and things. So that meant that the egg production, in addition to the normal inflationary pressures that were happening, all of a sudden the number of laying birds has really dropped off because of this disease issue. And that's what we saw with egg prices, where they just soared, more than doubled. I just saw a headline today that USDA is actually forecasting that they're going to fall by 30% in the next few months, as these flocks that are producing eggs are reestablished with new birds as well. So some of this is sort of, the inflationary impacts that are affecting the whole economy. Some of it is very specific just to eggs, or at least to chickens in this particular case. The consumer price index, which is what I showed you at the very beginning, the pie chart there, it's made up of lots of different products. I showed you the broad categories, but you can dig in and look a lot deeper into what that food cost looks like, transportation, those kind of things. This is some of the food at home prices, and I grabbed this about a month ago. And it was the change from October of 21 to October of 22. And here you can see egg prices going up by over 40%. If I had waited a month, it would have been even higher. But you also see at the bottom that beef actually went down by about 4% from October to October. And there's a couple of things going on there kind of to note. So one, beef had a big run up early in the pandemic, primarily due to processing issues. A lot of worker issues related to keeping workers healthy enough to keep those plants open. So beef prices really soared early on. But in this particular graph, I'm only looking at October of 21 to October of 22. So the peak happened for beef prices back in early 2021 and have since been falling as they resolved a lot of the health issues related to their labor supply. So if you're sitting here looking in just the last year, if you had went to the grocery store a year ago, you would say pork was cheaper a year ago than it is today, and beef was more expensive a year ago than it is now. So as a consumer, you might say, well, I was going to get a steak, but now I'm going to get a pork chop. Might have been something you said a year ago. But today you go in, those relative prices, beef has went down by about 4% and pork has gone up. You might say, well, this year I am going to buy the steak and not the pork chop. Right? So even in a rising environment, it's not an even inflation rate across all goods. So consumers can substitute. Maybe there's particular products that they don't mind substituting. Maybe you're just as happy, to have pork as you are to have a steak. But maybe there's other products where you're like, I really like bananas and I don't really want to substitute that for an orange. Right. So there's things that consumers are willing to make trade-offs on, and there's things that aren't. But as relative prices change between these, we do see consumers going to switch products to help stretch their budget a little further and still get them products that they're happy to have. Okay. Now let's talk about some kind of demand side issues. So kind of switching, and instead of looking things that have to do with how much is supplied into the economy, let's take a look at what are people buying. So one thing that happened during the economy, or during the coronavirus kind of lockdown and some of the restrictions that took place and the choices people made for their health, were people spent a whole lot more time at home. And whether that was because they were concerned about health, whether it was because they had remote work options for the first time, or they could participate in meetings at home or church or telemedicine appointments or school. All of the options for doing those things virtually expanded during that time period. So people spent more time at home. So what did that mean people did? Well, they ate more food at home, and they stopped eating at places like the MSU cafeteria, the school lunch program, restaurants, right? So I know initially, my wife's a teacher. When the school went to close that spring, they had all these little 1-pint milk jugs they were trying to get rid of before they expired, right? So the producers of milk in 1-pint things, they had kind of a surplus of them initially because all the schools weren't then buying them. People don't tend to buy a lot of milk by the pint or whatever the small amount is there that they give the kids at school. People buy it, in gallons and half gallons primarily to use at home. So there was kind of a shift in terms of how people were consuming some of those. The other thing people did when they spent time at home is they decided to do home improvement projects. And if you were trying to get lumber, building supplies, in kind of late 2020, early 2021, there were a lot of shortages, prices went up because everybody is at home staring at their wall, deciding it needs new paint. Right. So people are buying new trim, they're doing all these kinds of projects. And there was a big shift in increasing demand for those types of products. So prices went up as well. Now, I want to kind of highlight this with a couple of sort of anecdotes and then some actual facts as well. So this shift from goods to services, shipping volume soared. And I noticed someone earlier, I'd already started here, but shared on when I asked the previous question, they said they order more on Amazon because many local stores in Bozeman have limited in-stock products. Yeah. So things were unavailable locally. So you order it online. right? And I know that's happened at our house as well. Can't get something at the grocery store. So we'll see if we can order it. And in many cases we could, and then it came via delivery to our house. So in December of 21, I just remember looking out my window and there was a FedEx delivery truck and it was being followed by a U-Haul. And they had so many packages they couldn't fit them in the FedEx truck. So it was literally being followed by a second truck so they could get all the deliveries out. Now, I didn't see that in 2022. Right. So that was just my anecdote that I kind of started with is I thought, shipping had gone down some. So let's take a look at it kind of a different way from something I could actually get some data on. And we'll talk about container port volume. So these are the ports on the ocean where the giant container ships come and they unload all those, square box containers that then go onto a train or onto a truck. And they can contain all kinds of products, from electronics to clothes to anything else you can shove in those boxes. So this graph, which I got from one of the shipping sites, shows the volume of containers that came into the US in 2019, 20, 21, and 22. And so the blue line here is the amount of stuff that US imported through containers, right? And we import things other ways, but this is just kind of one gauge. And you'll see, is this, right here under 2.1 million of these containers went up a little, seasonally and then came back down. But then we moved to the red line, which is 2020, and we're actually lower than 2019 through April and May. And now everybody's at home, right? And they start ordering stuff, right? So then we start to see May, June, July, August, and it goes up here to really quite a lot higher than we had been in 2019. And then in 2021, we see it continue to remain high. And if you remember the headlines from then, here's just a couple of them: 40 cargo ships waiting at the LA and Long Beach ports. So they want to unload, but there's just not the capacity to get them unloaded. So they're waiting. And then we see here on this purple line is 2022, and it continues to be at these high levels until about mid 2022. And then we see it drop off. And now we've come down to almost exactly, at least in November here, to what we had in 2019. So prior to the pandemic. So essentially all the stuff we're ordering, assuming this line kind of stays where it's headed here, is back to kind of pre-pandemic levels, which is also what our infrastructure can easily support. Very difficult to add a new port or hundreds of trucks or trains to carry those containers out in a short time period. So when all this extra goods started to come through the economy that people were ordering, this is the prices for those containers in 2018 to 19, 20. They were about $3 to $5 or $3,000 to $5,000 per container. And then we see here about mid 2020, the prices start to skyrocket as that extra demand tries to come through that port. These prices go way up. When the prices go up, the price of all the goods being shipped go up as well. So again, shipping costs went from this sort of $3,000 to $4,000 number up to over $20,000 to ship those containers in. And again, all those costs are going to be added to the end products that are available. But then what you've also seen here in 2022 is these container rates have fallen back to below $5,000, right? So again, we've returned back to lower rates, which means those costs aren't being added to goods in the economy. Okay, so that's a good sign. That's going to cause downward pressure on prices. All right, so we talked a little bit about some supply side issues, some demand side issues. Now let's talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve Bank. You may hear them simply referred to as the Fed. It's a network of, I believe, 13 banks across the country. And they're not banks in the sense that you can go down and have a checking account with them. They're more of a bank for banks, might be an easy way to say it. When they were established by the federal government, they were given two tasks. One was price stability, and you can think about that as managing inflation, might be another way to say that. And the other one is maximum sustainable employment. So their job is to try to keep as many Americans working as reasonably possible. Now, that number is never going to be unemployment of zero, simply because, we may have too many accountants and not enough teachers, and we can't necessarily convert one to the other instantaneously, where we have not enough computer designers, but we have extra art teachers, right? So there's always sort of an optimal level of employment, but it's a low unemployment level. And oftentimes it's a balancing act between the two, right? So there's trade-offs. If they went fully towards, we want to have absolutely no inflation, likely unemployment would rise. And then on the other hand, if they went for full employment, inflation could go up. So there's some trade-offs in managing that need to be done between the two of these. And they don't necessarily get to set the unemployment rate or set the inflation rate, but they have some tools that they can use. One is called open market operations, and they buy and sell securities. And these are big quantities of securities to try to provide liquidity and encourage lending and investment across the economy. So when rates are lower, people and businesses tend to borrow to invest to grow the economy. So if they go out and buy a whole bunch of bonds, that drives the interest rates down a little. That encourages investors and banks and things to make investments. So that's one of the tools they have. They also have what's called a benchmark rate. I'll show you a graph on that in a minute. And oftentimes one of those is called the federal funds rate. They also have an overnight borrowing rate, and this isn't a rate that you or I would use. This is one large bank needs to borrow X number of dollars to meet their requirements for 12 hours until they reopen the next morning. And they do set that rate as well. The reason these rates are important, specifically that benchmark rate, is oftentimes it's heavily related to other rates in the economy that you and I might experience. So our mortgage when we go to get it, or a car loan, or your credit card if you're carrying a balance. Oftentimes these are tied very closely to these benchmark rates. So increasing or decreasing these rates usually influences all these other rates in the economy as well. So this is the federal funds target rate since 2006. And you can see back here in 2006 and 7, it was at about 5% or 5.25%. And then the Fed was, as the economy was changing coming into 2008, if they lower the rate, typically tries to kind of heat up the economy. So as we moved into this sort of housing related crisis, the Fed slowly lowered this, or every time they met would inch this rate down a little more, until they actually got to the point where the federal funds rate was at 0. And it sat at 0 from basically 2009 to 2016. And if you'll remember also that when I mentioned earlier, we had too low of inflation for a time period. Raising this rate can drive inflation down to some extent. So we had this problem. If we didn't see inflation in the economy, this rate sitting at 0 is really lower than they typically want it to be. But they were worried if they raised it, it could also drive inflation even lower. And we were already too low. But you can see here in 2016, they started to raise. And again, it kind of looks like some stair steps here as we started to move back up, and we got up to about 2.5%. And then when the pandemic originally started, they inched it down, and then quickly just said, we need to go right back to 0. Right. And then that's where it continued to stay, because they wanted to encourage the economy to continue to grow in 2020 and 2021. And then they started to see all these signs of inflation. And originally they thought some of these were what they were calling transitory, or some people were calling transitory. So that was things like the meat packing plant having trouble keeping workers. They put in plexiglass plates. There were people that had it, started to get immunity, and then vaccinations came out, and we had all these things that made it easier for those workers to be able to stay healthy enough to continue to come to work. And then they sort of assumed that some of those causes like that would go away, and then inflation wouldn't be high for an extended period. As it continued to stay high for a longer period, then the Fed started to raise their interest rates here to try to drive that inflation rate down. So you've seen a steady rise here. It's actually one more quarter point rise after I pulled this graph here as well. But again, this is closely tied to rates like car loans, mortgage loans as well. So we've seen rates that you and I do care about, because this one directly doesn't affect us. But this is what fixed mortgage rates look like in the US for the last roughly 20 years. In 2000, they were running around 8%. If you were to get a mortgage, then they basically slowly declined here through 2008 down to 2012, and they were running under 4%, which was historically phenomenally low. You know, we had some increases and decreases, and then in 2020, early 2020, late 2019, again, we were sitting at about 3%, which was remarkably low. Yeah, almost phenomenally low. But then as the Fed started to raise interest rates, that target rate, mortgage rates moved somewhat in step with that as well. And we've seen rates move from this sort of 3% range up to a little over 6% for 30-year mortgage rates. Now, why do we care about that? A 1% rise for somebody that's going down to get a new mortgage is going to raise their monthly interest rate by $60 for every $100,000 they borrow. So that $60 that they're now paying more for their house is money they can't spend elsewhere in the economy. Okay, it makes it harder for people to be able to afford to buy a home, which can put downward pressure on home prices, which again helps out inflation, can make housing less affordable in some sense. But again, there's kind of trade-offs between the couple of these. If you think about borrowing, you know, $400,000 or $500,000 here in Bozeman, and the interest rate goes up by, 3% from when you started looking, you can think about $180 for every 100,000. This could be easily $600 to $1,000 more in terms of your out-of-pocket cost for that same home, not because the price changed, but because of the interest rate charges for the loan that you're going to have to take to be able to pay for that. So again, trade-offs in the economy here as rates rise. Now, this is the Consumer Price Index monthly. And by monthly, what I mean here is not 4% this month, the last month, but 4% from this month to 1 month a year ago. So this would be November to November, June to June, what the difference is. And the blue line is the solid line is the Consumer Price Index. That's the number I showed you earlier. And what you can see here is back in 2020, again, it was running barely over 2%. During the kind of full stay-at-home time, it dropped to almost zero. And then, we saw it be still relatively low through 2020. And then in 2021, we really saw it start to increase up until year over year, we were over 8% if you just went from peak to peak. But then we've since seen it decline to about 6.4%. So the peak appeared to be early summer of 2022 in terms of year over year volatility or raises. So inflation has been declining relative to where it was, but we're still way above kind of this 2% target that the Fed had been aiming for many years. The other line I just wanted to put on here is inflation less food and energy. Sometimes food and energy are very volatile, so a lot of changes in oil prices month to month. Same with food prices, and they may be due to factors that are geopolitical or weather related, so not necessarily policy driven. So sometimes when the news wants to talk about these, or researchers, they'll talk about the Consumer Price Index minus food and energy, and that's sometimes called core inflation. So I just wanted to put that up there so that you had seen it, but it tends to be less volatile than the other two. But just another measure that's out there, but sometimes taking food and energy out helps you focus in and see trends a little bit better. All right. I wanted to kind of take my last few minutes here and just talk a little about what do I kind of expect looking forward. So first of all, some of the tools that the Fed has to manage inflation are going to impact some industries more than others. So because a lot of the tools the Fed have are related to interest rates, and raising interest rates helps manage inflation. Industries that utilize financing for people to buy their products can be impacted first. So if you're a home builder, it's going to be more expensive for your clients to be able to purchase and afford that home. Same for buying a new car or heavy equipment and those kind of things. They're going to be more sensitive than probably somebody working at a clothing store, at the mall, because people typically aren't taking a loan out to buy a new pair of blue jeans. So it's going to hit different industries differently. So some of the first ones we might see is housing prices, and I think nationwide, and maybe even here in the Gallatin Valley, we've seen a cooling a little bit of prices, maybe not necessarily a decline, but maybe things have softened just a little bit relative to that inflation rate change. The Federal Reserve also, they meet every 6 to 8 weeks, and they make these announcements about what the rate change will be, but they also put out notes and they give summaries kind of their meetings, and they don't like to surprise people. So they've indicated that they're likely to continue to raise rates. We don't know until the meeting actually happens, but they've indicated a slow and steady sort of raise as the path they're on. So if something other than that happened, it would be a little bit surprising, but it likely means they're going to continue to inch rates up, which again is going to help control inflation, but it may be a little bit harder on some industries than others. A couple of the other things looking forward that are hard to predict, and this is why, I don't have a crystal ball that can tell us what inflation will be in a year. Bird flu, it looks like the current round of bird flu is kind of behind us. They're rebuilding those herds, which means egg prices are falling back down to something that's much closer to normal over the next few months. Could there be another round of bird flu or mad cow disease or any other type of illness that might affect livestock? It's possible. We don't know how the Russia-Ukraine conflict is going to end. Maybe there'll be a different conflict in the world that'll come up. So hard to predict these things, but they can all have an impact on inflation, not just in the US, but worldwide. We haven't seen in a while coronavirus infection waves that have resulted in large numbers of the workforce being unavailable. But could it happen again, or could something happen, a different infection? Certainly it could, and that could certainly impact inflation and worker supply across the globe, or at least in a particular region as well. Weather events, very difficult to predict. I mean, early freeze or late freeze in the citrus region could have big impacts on the prices of, grapefruit or something. Again, it's going to cause a price impact that's also going to impact inflation, but we don't know what those things are going to be. But there's likely going to be some of these things in 2023. And then legislative policy, again, I don't have a crystal ball on what they're going to do, but things like stimulus packages can have impacts on what inflation will be. Some of the tools they've got policy-wise can all have an impact, and that's true in terms of timing and quantity. So are they going to essentially give more money out in some format? Or are they going to spend some of that funds quickly? Or are they going to make it stretch over a number of years? All decisions that policymakers, will make. And also, if they decided to put, let's say, lots and lots of that surplus into building steel bridges, that can have an impact on what the cost of bridge workers are, because there's only so many of them out there, and how much steel is going to cost if all of a sudden there's this big impact that everybody wants to buy new steel for a bridge. You can drive inflation up that way as well. So legislative policy matters. I don't know what it'll look like. But if you really wanted to, watch going forward, that's something you need to kind of have a little bit of an eye on as well. So, well, that's the last slide that I put together for tonight. I know we probably didn't answer every question, but do you have any questions or any comments you wanted to share? And I'll be happy to see if I can address kind of any of those.
Hi, so I hope you can hear me while people are typing in. I just had one kind of question. When it comes to low inflation, what exactly does that mean for the economy, and why is that bad? Because as a consumer, I feel like that would be a good thing.
Yeah, well, let's just make one example, kind of a little bit to the extreme to say why some inflation is good, negative is bad. So let's say you bought a house and you just locked in what your mortgage payment will be for the next 30 years. And let's say you have to pay just $1,000 a month, right? And you know how much you take home in a paycheck every month, and you can afford this $1,000, payment. Now, most people over time, you might, even if it's just a 1% raise or a 2% raise, we get modest raises over the course of our career. And maybe you switch jobs or get a promotion and get a larger increase somewhere along the line, but you're continuing to be able to afford that payment. If we have a situation called stagflation, where you don't have any economic growth and you have limited inflation, or if inflation actually turns negative, that actually puts downward or negative pressure on wages. So if you're making less a year from now than you are now, that $1,000 fixed payment you have can become more challenging for you to repay. And if you have lots of defaults in the economy on loans, that can be a challenge. So that's why negative inflation is bad. And typically that optimal number, and again, kind of the Fed has come up with this, is 2% is usually kind of what they aim for. Not that they ever hit 2%, but if people expect prices to rise at 1 to 3% per year, they plan for that. It also doesn't create sort of these challenges where somebody may have taken out a loan payment and then their wages are absolutely flat, or even decline, and then they have trouble making it. So too low can be a problem. On the other side, let's just say you had bought a house in 2020 and you locked in a 30-year rate at 3%, and now all of a sudden your employer is giving you a 5% raise just to keep you up with inflation. It's actually easier every year for you to make that housing payment as you get these 5% raises, but your mortgage is fixed for 30 years, right?
Mhm.
Now, if you're a renter, your house payment may change every 12 months, right, as you renew a lease. So it's going to affect different consumers in different ways, but kind of a slow, steady, predictable, modest inflation rate is usually what kind of the goal is.
Since we're still waiting for anybody else with questions, another one I had was, I've seen gas prices go up and down. We've all seen that. Maybe a little bit with beef and other grocery items, but for most things as a consumer, it seems that prices just keep going up. The same with housing costs. So if a house that was worth 100,000 10 years ago is now 200 or 300,000 today, that's not going to go back down, right?
Well, we certainly have seen some situations where housing prices have declined, right? 2008, 7 around Bozeman, it dipped some, but certainly if you're here locally in Bozeman, we've seen, housing prices rising at much faster than inflation for 2 decades.
Yeah.
Or 3 or something in that range, right? So there are, and part of that is increased demand. Bozeman's a popular place to be. People have been growing. If you're in places, like maybe more of the Rust Belt, the industrial part of the US where populations haven't been flocking into there, we haven't seen substantial housing price declines over a 20-year period, right? So housing prices can go down, but generally the statement you kind of made, though, is it seems like prices continue to go up collectively. And that's certainly true. If we had, let's say, 2% inflation every year, roughly every product would go up 2% in price every year. Right. So that's consistent with everything you're seeing. Ideally, wage rates would be going up faster than that. I was actually just seeing wage rates have risen quickly in the last couple of years, more so than prior to the pandemic. But over the last 12 months, I was actually reading that, nationally, wage rates have not risen as fast as inflation over the last 12 months. So that means the purchasing power of consumers has gone down over the last year. So you go to work, maybe you bring home more money, but it's not buying you as many goods and services as it would have. So collectively, in terms of sort of the well-being of the country, you'd like wage rates to be rising faster than inflation, and then collectively, then we can buy more goods and services for consumers everywhere.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Give it another minute or so. See if anybody else types in a question. If you're working on a question, feel free to raise your hand so we know that you're typing before we kind of close out. If you missed the beginning, we will be posting this on YouTube. You can check the library events calendars for any kind of upcoming programs that we have, including the March estate planning. All right. Well, I'm going to call it. Thank you so much, Joel, for doing this. I really appreciate it. I thought this was very fascinating. So,
You're welcome. Hopefully it was enlightening.
yeah. All right. Thank you. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.